Hi, I'm Joe Connolly. Today you are going to meet a man who is quoted in the news all the time, Jonathan Bowles, director of the Center for an Urban Future, a nonpartisan think tank to increase economic mobility in New York. And that just means raising all boats and all of the people in them to grow the middle class. Producer Neil A. Carousso will join us in this discussion too. Jonathan, how do you see New York coming back from the pandemic?
Well, thanks, Joe. It's really great to have me on this show today. I'm really optimistic about New York. New York's always bounced back before, but there's some significant challenges that I think we all have to be honest about, and they're going to take some real specific actions and steps on behalf of our policymakers. We've got to make sure that New York holds on to what got us here. So many of the New Yorkers that have left or have considered leaving, we've got to make sure they're back. We got to make sure that that New York, that we start going back and supporting the institutions that made New York great, our small businesses and entrepreneurs. We've got to make sure that people start spending money again. We've got to make sure the artists and institutions like museums and performing arts institutions are there, because really it's the city's vitality. Things that happen in neighborhoods across the city that are going to have this reinforcing mechanism and kind of really show people, not just in New York, but around the world, that the city is back.
So it sounds though as though you're saying it's going to need help. It's not going to happen on its own, Jonathan?
I think that we are going to see a certain amount of this. I mean, we already see that some businesses are starting. A pretty large number of businesses have gotten started. New Yorkers are getting back into indoor dining. But I think that it's got to be helped. I think that this past year was so devastating. And I think there's still some people on the fence about this city. And I think that that's why we've got to make whatever starts to happen with folks that are getting back and spending money and supporting our businesses and institutions. We've got to reinforce that. And I think that the city and state policymakers can do so with some targeted interventions and also some marketing and promotion. I think we've got to really hit this and make sure that we prime the pump and really reinforce that New York isn't dead, that things are happening in the right direction, but that more can happen and is needed.
Now, some will say the federal government is already putting trillions of dollars into the national economy. So will it just cost more money to do the things that you're suggesting, or can it happen other ways?
I think that I think money helps
Right.
because New York City has a higher unemployment rate than almost any other big city in America right now, over 12%. So let's be clear that New York isn't just like any other place right now. We have more folks that are unemployed, and a higher share of the people are unemployed here, and that affects their ability to go out and spend money at restaurants and stores and other things. So I think that that more can be done, but I think also there needs to be a really strong message to New Yorkers to go out and help these businesses and institutions.
Like some new I Love New York, which was a campaign that paid off for 30 years.
I couldn't agree more. And you know what? I don't feel like that there's been enough of that. And you know what? Not just targeted at the rest of the world, but targeted at New Yorkers. And I Love New York that's saying, if you really love New York, not only stay here right now, but go out and support small businesses, go out and support local artists, get outside. I think that, until we have the kind of tourist boom that we had prior to the pandemic, and that's going to take some time, New Yorkers have got to take on some of this responsibility. After 9/11, it felt like almost a patriotic duty to go out and see a Broadway show. We've got to make it like it's a patriotic duty again to get out and support our small businesses more than before, because otherwise, a lot of them just aren't going to hang on.
Well, the fact that many other areas have done better over this period than Manhattan have long-term implications that you see?
Yeah, I think that there are some real structural challenges facing the city. I mean, I think most people believe that we're not going to see as many people go back to office work. Who knows how much it's going to be? But let's say if it's 10 or 20% fewer people going into midtown or downtown offices, that's going to have a huge impact on service sector workers, people working in the restaurants and bars and retail stores around there, but also building support services, janitorial services, maybe even people driving cabs and Ubers. I fear the most for the lower wage workforce in New York City, many of whom were already disproportionately hurt because of the pandemic. People in restaurants, retail, nail salons, childcare. A lot of them may be hurt by some of these structural issues like remote work. I'd also add that another big structural challenge that New York is facing is with business travel. With Zoom and other technologies, we may not see as many people come to the city for business, for board meetings and other things. Those folks go to restaurants with their expense accounts on Monday nights and Tuesday nights, helping out restaurants. They go see Broadway shows. All of that supports this larger low-wage workforce that I'm really worried about.
It was interesting that you suggest that the vacuum might just not be refilled, that New York may not refill itself. I didn't think about it needing that much help. I just thought so many of us are dying to get back in who don't live in the city anymore, as I did, that the demand would come back. That may not be necessarily so.
I just think that there's a lot of uncertainty with the post-COVID period.
Yeah.
As you know, a lot of affluent people have left, and some are coming back, and some are probably still on the fence about whether they're going to come back. You've got some people that are considering Miami, Austin. Should they go down there and look for work, or should they move their company to those places? There's this kind of inflection point that I think that for the next 6 months or so, some people may be deciding what they're going to do. What are the subways going to come back? Are we going to see the city as lively as it was before? Because people put up with a lot, including higher costs to be here. And I think earlier, for such a long time, the positives always kind of outweighed all of those negatives of being in New York. And I think that some people are trying to figure out, well, are enough of the positives going to come back to kind of outweigh those costs? And I think that, we don't know for sure. And that's why I think we have to probably help it along, and promote the things that are coming back, and that promote the kind of good behaviors and spending that I've been talking about, that just kind of make it so that it starts spiraling in the right direction. I spoke to somebody who runs a big advertising company in New York, and he has part of his company in Australia and Moscow. And I was really encouraged. He said that when those places, they're both ahead of New York and the head of the US in terms of just kind of getting society back. And he said that when it came back, it just came back. Like, it was like not over a period of 4 months. It was like a 2-week period when everything just snapped back. And he said he thinks that New York could happen in New York, maybe later in the summer or early in the fall, but that we've got to just kind of reinforce that, and make sure that if it is happening, that we get the word out that it's happening, and that New Yorkers believe it, but that also people all over the world and across the country, they see, oh, New York's back,
Yeah.
Right.
To me,
When FOMO kicks in again,
Yeah.
fear of missing out. Come on down from Rockland County.
That's exactly it. Fear of missing out.
and I think too, people are they don't know when it's going to come back, and people are already out and about. Seems like people in our business, it's like it hurts to hear that people have tuned off the news, and I hear a lot from people that are like, you know what, if I get it, I get it. Death rates are down, and so the behavior is really critical to stopping it so that we can recover fully, like you said.
Yeah, and the behavior is really important when it comes to things like the subway. The subway is so important to coming back. We talked about Midtown earlier, but also just in general, I think that it's one of those positives that I mentioned. If people don't feel safe riding the subways, and I mean safe from the virus, mostly, although obviously some people are fearing for other things like crime. But I think if people don't feel safe riding the subway, that's going to mess with New York's recovery in a big way. And, obviously there's only so much that the MTA can do because, like they can clean the trains, they're clean. People aren't even, people are amazed how clean the trains have gotten, but you can't kind of do anything about, your fellow New Yorkers, are they going to is everybody going to wear masks? Do we know, are they all vaccinated? And is there any kind of fear of getting anything again? And so that's why I really do agree with you that some of those health issues and like, what can we do to make sure that New York is healthy and safe again?
Jonathan, what is the reason behind the outer boroughs expanding? Can you explain that?
Yeah, I think that the boroughs have generally held up much better than Midtown because people are working in their neighborhoods where they live. And so, people are still, buying things and shopping and ordering takeout, but they're not doing it where they work. Or they're doing it where they work now, which is usually at their home or close to their home. And so a lot of outer borough business districts have held up very well. Some are thriving. I think most still are struggling to some extent because, let's take a coffee shop, for example. The coffee shop in your local neighborhood in Queens or the Bronx or Brooklyn or Staten Island, maybe doing better than that kind of, coffee joint near your office in Manhattan. But a lot of people are also having coffee at home and not going out and purchasing it. So businesses are still struggling in neighborhoods, but they're just holding up a lot better than those in Midtown.
Interesting. And how made the changing demographics in these outer boroughs change that? And, what are some of the successful businesses right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that from a kind of a storefront perspective, businesses are starting up in the boroughs. We did a little analysis of new business formation in Brooklyn and found a significant increase, even compared to the months prior to the pandemic. New businesses are being formed, and a lot of those are retail and restaurant businesses. So that's an encouraging sign. I think they see that people are sticking put in their neighborhoods and are spending dollars there. And I think that those businesses are also betting on the fact that people are going to stay there more, and that whatever they used to see in terms of foot traffic for those neighborhoods, it's now going to be significantly increased. And so, so I think those retail and restaurant businesses, I think, are looking good. I'm a little more worried about retail going forward. I think that, people have gotten so used to shopping online during this pandemic. Some people were already doing so beforehand, but a lot of other people, even like, older folks that may not have been kind of technologically, proficient, they're now used to shopping this way in a way that they weren't before. And so I think we may see, clothing stores and accessory stores, shoe stores, we may see kind of a tougher road for those things, even in neighborhoods outside of Manhattan.
What will be the new businesses or tenants that come in? What types of industries do you think, Jonathan? Who's going to fill this void?
I think there's still this is a restaurant town. I think that after the pandemic, people are going to be itching to get out and be social again. Even if that means dining more on the streets or drinking on the streets at an outdoor cafe type situation. But I think that those did amazingly well before the pandemic. We saw over 100,000 restaurant jobs grow in just the decade before the pandemic. I think that's going to come back pretty strong. I think that, retail is a bit iffy, as I was saying, but I think that a whole host of other sectors are really going to power the economy. I think tech was already strong prior to the pandemic, and we're seeing that a significant number of tech companies are being started. In fact, we have a report coming out this week. We looked at job postings for the site Burning Glass, and a really significant share of the new jobs during the pandemic that are being created are in technology positions. And so that's one. Healthcare and public health, I could see a lot more jobs growing there, not only because of the pandemic and all the health aspects that created, but also we have an aging population. And so I think that there's going to be a lot more businesses that are catering towards older New Yorkers.
I know you do a lot of research and studies of job training, upskilling as it's called. I go to some of the community colleges that seem to have excellent programs for training people in hospitals and in healthcare. Yet there always seems to be a shortage of employees. What is this bottleneck in upskilling of people, Jonathan?
You're absolutely right, and thank you for asking, Joe. I mean, I think this is the time that we ought to be investing in job training and human capital development and just all kinds of skills development, including upskilling, because we've got about 12% unemployment right now. Many of those jobs that people had that were accessible for people without a college degree, like those at hotels or in restaurants, in nail salons, they're slower to come back right now. And so, we've got to make sure that people get that upskilling, like you're saying, so that maybe they can get into something else, whether it's maybe in the growing green economy, in a technology position, but those are going to take, kind of programs at community colleges, or really excellent job training programs like a Perscolis or a Pursuit, two organizations that are doing fantastic work in the job training area. But right now, those organizations are serving a few dozen or a few hundred people a year. We've got to make that a few thousand, and CUNY and their community colleges have such potential to upskill people at scale. But right now, there's not that much happening in terms of helping people that already have jobs to kind of build up their skills to another level, that kind of upskilling. And we've got to be making those kind of investments.
Is that because of the affordability or the hours in which the courses are given? Do you have any idea why aren't people going to these places that you mentioned, Perscolis, and what were the two that you mentioned?
I mean, Perscolis and Pursuit. Those are two. There's other excellent programs. I guess that it's really expensive to do the kind of training that actually leads to jobs. Right. I think for years, a lot of workforce development or training programs, I think, were kind of criticized because they said you're training for people with skills, but not necessarily training them to get a specific job. And those organizations that I mentioned, they work with companies, with employers to figure out what exactly are their skill needs. What do they need to hire for? And then they go and they create this boot camp that gets people those skills. And those are folks from without a college background, people from really, difficult backgrounds, but they're able to prepare them for those positions, and they actually get jobs at the end. But it's very expensive per person to do that kind of training. And also, there's a lot of basic skills that you need just to get into one of those kind of training programs. And I think that we've advocated at the Center for Our Future that there are more programs that provide bridges into those kind of training programs. Because right now, the Perscolises and Pursuits of the world, they actually have to reject a lot of their applicants because they're lacking in basic literacy or numeracy skills. And so, with more of that, more of the right people, they would be able to actually get more people in. But there's no shortage of people that want to get into these programs. But I think that more investment is needed so they can do that kind of high cost training. And also we need to have more feeders, more bridges into those programs so that they're kind of open up to more New Yorkers.
Jonathan, that on-the-job training I hear is so important to career development, but right now it's so difficult with the virtual environment. People aren't really being allowed in, especially coming out of college. So how do you combat that and offer that training to people that they need to succeed in the workforce?
I think that virtual training is a real opportunity. I mean, honestly, we saw that one of the challenges for people to enroll into a job training program before the pandemic was just the difficulty of scheduling or transportation costs that were involved in that, getting from your home and figuring out daycare for your kids. Sometimes people went to job training after their own job ended, but then how do they kind of care for their kids or pay for childcare? And virtual training has the potential to let people that have those issues, that they're dealing with those things, to do the training virtually so they can kind of be at their home. And so I think that organizations need to ramp up their ability to do that kind of virtual training. Many of them really are, and they pivoted during this pandemic in a really excellent way. But I think there's an opportunity, even as we go back to in-person training classes, to also continue expanding that virtual training. I think that has the potential of reaching to so many more people.
That could be the bridge you were talking about. The virtual training is the bridge, maybe.
It's a great idea. It's a great idea.
Neil?
Yeah, and you were talking earlier about turnover, small business turnover, and one thing I was wondering is, how will the market stabilize? What is the key to stability right now? Because there's always turnover, but right now it's obviously centralized in the restaurants and hospitality.
It's funny. I've done so many studies over the years about small businesses and entrepreneurs in New York City. And I think that the one thing that I've learned more than any is that what small businesses need most is business. They need customers. And I think that during this pandemic that we've seen that they've lost such a huge share of their customers, their reliable customer base. And so I think that, that's why I was pitching that kind of like campaign, that marketing campaign to New Yorkers to go out and support your local businesses. I think many New Yorkers are already doing that, but I think that we need to really kind of feel it more, that doing so is going to help keep those small businesses alive. I was talking to somebody that's doing some really interesting work in an organization called Rethink Food, which has tried to kind of make sure that when we're providing emergency food, like food bank type services for older adults or others in need, that we don't just kind of contract with those big food service corporations, some of whom aren't even based in New York, but we do that through supporting local small restaurants in communities that often provide the food that people in their communities actually want, but that could also provide a stable funding source for local restaurants that are so dependent on just customers, and it gives them this really thin profit margin. But we got to think about other ways that might help these restaurants kind of expand their revenues or have a different source of funding. So, all things should be on the table, but we've got to help these restaurants and bars and other neighborhood businesses survive.
With parallel lines. I was smiling because you reminded me of the quote by the president who once said, "The business of America is business." I think you're going to go into the history books too with what small businesses need is business. What, just to wrap up, Jonathan, are we going to see, do you think, office towers being turned into residential apartments?
I think that we're going to be seeing some of that. I'm a little skittish or worried about doing too much of that. We saw such great business growth and office growth in the years leading up to the pandemic. And I'm a little worried that if we convert too many of our offices to residences, that office prices will go up to the extent that a lot of small businesses or growing businesses might not be able to afford the office, right? So I think we have to be a little careful about that. But absolutely, we are going to see some of those conversions. I think we're also seeing hotel conversions, but some of that will happen. But I think also conversely, in the boroughs outside of Manhattan, we're probably going to be seeing some things converted into offices. For instance, maybe the second and third floors of retail establishments in the boroughs might become offices or co-working spaces for people to work, people that don't want to work in their house, but want to work closer to their home and not take the subway into Manhattan.
We've been hearing, too, about a lot of new businesses that are starting up having an advantage over incumbent businesses because they have such lower startup costs, they have lower rents, and they're coming in at lower costs, which is interesting. I want to...
You're right about that. I don't think there's anything we can do. In fact, I think the city and state should do as much as they can to encourage entrepreneurship right now. I think we've got to make it as easy as possible for people to get started. And obviously, let's try to do what we can to have those existing businesses hang on. Let's support them through the marketing campaigns and other incentives. One of the things we're calling for is a year-long moratorium on fines and fees for all businesses. We know there's a long runway for businesses to get back to health. And we ought to support them. But I think that we ought to also help those that are trying to get started because our neighborhoods need it. And entrepreneurship can really be a path forward right now.
And just to wrap up, Jonathan, is there a stat or two that come to mind that you have seen recently that you find the most interesting, that caught your attention on the future of New York?
Well, I have to say that this is not the most optimistic stat, Joe, but about a month ago, we did an analysis of the 50 largest cities in America of their unemployment rates, and we found that New York City had the third highest. So that was worrying, and I think it's something to keep in mind that as much as New York has always bounced back in these situations, as much as New York is resilient, New York is facing some significant issues. And we are, in many ways, struggling more than most other places in America right now, and we need a lot of help to get back.
I Love New York is going to make a comeback. There's something like New Yorkers love New York, or we'll put a jingle to it. I think you're right on that some marketing has to be done. And as you put it, two New Yorkers. I haven't heard that in a long time, if ever.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we need it.
Thank you. Great to meet you, Jonathan, and keep up the good research.
Thanks so much, Joe. Appreciate having me on.